Welcome to our webinar, Phrases That Help and Hinder, Nudging Children Toward Healthy Eating Habits with Language. We're super thrilled to have you here. My name is Jeb Bastian. I'm an assistant professor and extension nutrition and health state specialist at South Dakota State University, and I will be the moderator for today's session. This is a novel and unique webinar sponsored by the National Port Board and planned in conjunction with the National CACFP Sponsors Association. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to our first speaker today, Kristen Hicks-Rue.
Thanks, Jeb, and thanks everyone for attending. I love seeing where everyone is at and how we have not only dietitians, but also a lot of caregivers and educators from all levels. So I think that's great. We're happy you're here. So I'm really going to talk about what do we know about food choice, food exposure, language, and food acceptance, and what's the research behind it. Next slide, please. So here are my disclosures. Next slide, please. I'm going to have three kind of main categories. Number one is what drives food choice in children. And really, this is a look from the lens of animal proteins, but it can be portrayed across the food groups. What's the relationship between food exposure, language, and food acceptance in children? And ultimately, what does that mean for you? And so I'm going to set the stage for Isabel and Emily to really give you a lot of tangible advice and tips on how to improve positive food language. So one of my favorite models in research and healthcare and education is the socio-ecological model influencing food choice. And the reason that this is so important is because it shows that food choice is not a simple choice. There's many factors that go into why children and why people in general choose the foods that they do. And so we're going to go through this kind of tier by tier. And it's important when we think about children and infants and young children that we're providing exposure and opportunity for them to develop why they're going to choose the foods that they do over time. So we're going to go everywhere from biology to their experience, the personal drivers, and then ultimately, what are those environmental drivers? And each of these is going to influence all of our food choices. Next slide, please. So ultimately, what does the research say? In a review of 88 studies on factors that influence children's eating, we know that it has something to do with the food modeling, so how parents and caregivers and peers model food, and then how they expose. So parents and caregivers should expose their children to a range of good food choices while also acting as positive role models. Let me tell you, I'm a mom of 3 young kids, and this is not an easy task. Whether, I'm a dietitian too, but whether you're a parent, a dietitian, a caregiver, or someone who just works with children, you don't have to be perfect. The skills that we're going to give you today are just tools in your toolbox, and use what you feel like is going to be most receptive and acceptable for your children that you're going to be working with. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I told you, we're going to talk about this socio-ecological model because I think it's important to get a holistic view on why children are choosing those foods that they are choosing. So number one, it talks about what's the flavor in the womb. And I think a lot of people don't realize this, that we actually have the research to go behind the chemosensory evidence of flavor recognition in the womb. So this is an opportunity for caregivers and dietitians alike on how can we improve and expose these babies in utero with different flavors. So this is an opportunity for fruits and vegetables and lean protein options because these children are starting to develop taste and pleasure. They start to develop all their senses, right? Sweet, sour, salt, and bitter. And so all of that is beginning to happen in the womb. And this can ultimately lead to food and decision-making later on in life. All right, next slide, please. But secondly is their experience with food. And so we are actually going to launch a poll here. I'm curious if you can tell me, let's go ahead and launch the poll, please. How many flavor nuances do you think there are in pork? 10, 30, 50, or over 90? So the correct answer was over 90 flavor nuances. And I think this is incredible. We have a researcher who has done this. Some of these flavor nuances are caramel and rose and mushroom and smoke and kokumi, which is actually thought of as the 6th flavor element. And that really talks about flavors and delivers that mouthfeel. And we're going to get more into why we think pork can help with this experience with food and start to have that associative conditioning to better have variety and offerings in food choices. So yeah, over 90 flavor nuances in pork. All right, go ahead, Nate. So not only is it the experience with food, but then we also have to think about it physiology wise, right? And so when children are starting to be exposed to new foods, they're thinking about familiarity. Is it something they've seen before? They've tasted before. And Isabel's going to give you a lot of these really wonderful sensory words that you can talk about with food. But then it's also about conditioned satiety. At these young ages, this is a premier opportunity to allow children to learn that their body is full by their own mechanisms and not necessarily when we think they're full, even though, trust me, as a mom, I'm like, I know when you're full. There's no way you're full yet. But conditioned satiety, if you look at that graph on the right, you can see what a high protein breakfast versus a normal protein versus a control, which is a skipped breakfast, that when we have a high protein breakfast, things consuming like animal protein, like maybe some fresh pork in there, or sausage, you can have a lower hunger drive and an increased fullness. And so I think this is important because this allows children to recognize when they feel they're full and when they think that they're all done. And so protein is a key player when it comes to satiety, and that's an important reason why we want to work on exposure from the animal protein side. Next slide, please. But also, it's all about exposure. And I will say that probably more times than you're ever going to want to hear. And many of you are dietitians or work with children, and you know that exposure is going to be critical, right? And so exposure to not only the different types of foods, but now we're seeing a lot of research coming out on these different feeding strategies. And if you work with small children, you've probably always heard of the standard pureed foods, especially when you're thinking about complementary feeding. But kind of more of the new age approach that you're seeing parents and caregivers and dietitians alike is this whole baby-led weaning. And this is a whole nother webinar series I feel like I could talk about. But all of these experiences with food and this complementary, these young ages between 6 months and 2 years old, this is when not only the experience with food, so actually touching and tasting, but then the parenting practices and how they're serving and offering the food, and not only how they're serving, how they're talking about food. And so we're going to get into a lot of some of the practice applications, but really that language around food all is associating with that experience. Next slide, please. So we know that caregivers have a significant influence when it comes to why they're purchasing their food that they do and choosing nutrient-dense animal proteins as part of their family dietary pattern. So we know that it's important that if it's something that they enjoy eating, so if it tastes delicious or it's something that they love eating, it may influence whether they're going to purchase animal proteins. And so we always have our personal biases, and this is going to happen in family subunits as well, right? So family subunits, if the parents or the caregivers are purchasing food, then they're exposing it. And if they're not purchasing the food, then those children are having missed exposure. And so we believe that it's important, again, to offer that variety, balance, and moderation, and especially thinking about how are you serving these different animal proteins? And maybe is it a serving the way that you're serving or the way that you're cooking? And maybe it's something that you can also be exposed to increase your eating pleasures as well. Next slide, please. So this third part of the model, I told you, this is really complex. This is complex stuff, y'all. When we think about food choice, there's so many intertwining factors. But the third one are these person-related determinants. These are things like attitudes and perceptions and beliefs about food. And these start at young ages. So as we can expose these children, we can then help to frame their perceptions and the thought of, what do they think about pork? What do they think about different animal proteins? How does this impact or motivate them or their skills or knowledge about the food? But then also the relationships between people and how that then influences their food choice. So there's been research that looks at a survey of all family caregivers and looking at when parents have an attachment to meat, it correlates to child consumption. So if parents do not, or they have a detachment to meat, then they may not be serving that. And that's a missed opportunity because these lean, fresh animal proteins can provide a lot of not only the macronutrients, the high quality protein, but also a lot of these micronutrients that are often not thought about. Things in pork like selenium, zinc, iron, choline, right? And these are all important for growth, development, immunity, and mood. And so these are all ways that we can encourage and offer these children opportunities to develop their own relationship with food and food decision making. Next slide, please. And the last one that is probably the most tricky is where many dietitians and caregivers are going to all come into play as well, right? We know that pork is the #1 consumed animal protein worldwide, and that's a cultural component. And so bringing in those cultural foods, whether it's your daycare facility or it's an education, or maybe it's an in-home daycare or a private practice, embracing those cultural foods is a great way to connect children to the foods of their family origin. But also we know that there's a lot of environmental determinants with food, things like price. We've done some research on the Thrifty Food Plan, and we've shown that pork is one of the most affordable proteins as part of the dietary guidelines for Americans' eating pattern. And so when price is coming into it, that's another way that dietitians have the opportunity to work with the clientele, work with the patients, caregivers, and participants to really making sure that they're providing not only nutritious protein options, but meeting their family needs culturally and affordability wise. And then what kind of information and education and media are they receiving? And so when we think about exposure to children in these animal proteins, it's important to think about what are they hearing and how can we as dietitians do a better job at making sure that it's informing what the truth behind the science is. And hopefully you'll learn some of that here today in some of these applications. Next slide, please. So when we think about food acceptance, there's 4 main kind of steps in the process, right? And so these are opportunities for dietitians to come in and intervene and support parents and caregivers and educators in the process. And the first one is familiarization. These are things like we can expose in different cooking methods, whether you're cooking, let's say, a steamed broccoli. Are you going to steam it? Are you going to saute it? Are you going to serve it in an air fryer? Having that familiarity experience is a great way to expose children in different types of methods and then different types of meals as well. The second stage is going to be observation. So children are always looking. If they're anything like my kids, if I'm not eating it, they're not eating it. And so observing what their peers, what their siblings, what their caregivers are doing. Are they turning that food away, or are they embracing that food and talking about the texture? And it's not going to be perfect the first time. It's going to take multiple exposures. The third is going to be associative. So this is when children start to make associations of food. If they associate with, okay, this is a food that's good for me, or this is a food that is a protein food, or this is a food that provides these nutrients. And this is where we can work on food language to help to describe foods. What are they getting from those foods? Sorry. And then lastly is going to be that categorization. And this is where a child ultimately decides, am I going to like it or am I not? And they basically put it into these categories, yay or nay, good or bad, healthy, unhealthy, whatever words that they're using. And so these, again, are opportunities for us to embrace food language and how we can positively promote that categorization. What do you think is the minimum exposures to a new food before you feel like it's trusted? All right, so a lot of people have heard this maybe before, and the correct answer is 15. So let's talk about this. A little over half had that. So next point, please. So we know that it takes about 15 exposures of a new food before it's trusted and tasted. And when we think about exposure, it's talking about the different preparation methods, how you're serving it, the temperature, and they're going to, Isabel and Emily are going to talk a lot more about that. Next, please. But also, not only is it 15 exposures, Nate, you can hit the next button, please. But it takes about 10 to 15 more exposures to bring about the liking of the food. So this takes work. This is an opportunity, though, for dietitians and caregivers to really support children, and it's okay if they don't like it the first time. We can offer it again. Next, please. So when we think about animal proteins, what often happens is in this 2 to 6 year old age, this is where a lot of neophobia or fear of food begins. And we know that when we can have repeated exposures, whether it's animal proteins or vegetables or fruits, that is an opportunity to overcome neophobia that's going to persist throughout life. And so here is a great opportunity for us as dietitians to intervene. Next. And one of the ways that we can do that is by offering foods with foods of flavor and foods of fun and foods of familiarity. And one of those may be lean pork. So lean pork can help to bust this neophobia. And we talk about pork as the ultimate carrier food because we have research to support that when pork is on the plate, it carries along different fruits and vegetables and whole grains and food groups. And that ultimately carries nutrients, things like potassium and choline. And this is a great way to have children kind of get all the nutrients that they want, and pork is almost the tie together. Next, please. And so when we're talking about pork as this ultimate carrier food, again, it kind of brings these nutrients together. So if you look at some of these dishes, I tried to have a variety here. When pork is on the plate, you can see they have like little sweet potato dishes with some pineapple. So you're getting fruits and potassium. You're also going to have that exposure in that top right picture. Maybe it's a bowl. You can have some whole grains and brown rice and some different fruits and vegetables. Or then there at the bottom, you can add in the protein foods and the iron and the vegetables. So again, it kind of, how can we beautify the dishes and really carry all the foods? So you're bringing the pork, which may be that flavor component, but also the high protein, but then it also ties together a lot of those nutrients of concern. Next, please. So what are they saying in terms of the research? We know that children ultimately eat what they like, but food intake is often driven by what they don't like. And much of that has to do with the conversation around the table. They pick up on what's said, and that ultimately impacts their perceptions of food. Next, please. So one of the ways that we can help that, especially in care centers and daycare facilities and things of the like, is the use of child-centered nutrition phases. So let's have that last poll, please. So have you ever heard of child-centered nutrition phases before today's talk? Okay, so it looks like a majority have not. Okay, so what these child-centered nutrition phases are these are phrases that you can see examples on the left. They're a great way to engage and embrace and promote the positivity of food and activity. Things like, oh, it can give you energy, or it can help you learn or run fast. And we know that when child-centered nutrition phases are coupled with repeated exposure, it will increase consumption over time. And so this is a great opportunity to not only talk about how we're serving the food, but then how we're talking about it. Next, please. So to tie it all together, there's a lot going on in this slide, but some of the big ones, the key strategies are in red, is thinking about how we can improve children's eating behavior from many different avenues, things like family meals and exposure, or parenting style, or promoting self-regulation and recognizing fullness. So I'm going to pass it to Isabel as we move forward, but you will have access to the recording.
All right, thank you, Kristen. Allow me to continue and talk about nudging those children towards healthy eating habits using language. But first, here are my disclosures. I work for the National CACFP Sponsors Association. Let's talk about the foods we eat and the types of languages we use around food. Children begin to communicate through grunts and gestures. As they learn from listening to others, they can use 1 to 2 words to convey a message. Over time, those actions and words become clearer, and they can communicate more about the foods they eat. They formulate their opinions on foods based off of several reasons. For example, it could be their own past experiences with the foods, but since their taste buds are rather new, they also rely on the responses from those around them pertaining to food, as Kristen had mentioned earlier. Speaking of reacting to the response from those around them, this includes our own actions around food, our body language, and the words we associate with the foods we eat. Children are keen observers and will pick up on how you feel about the food, which could impact child eating behaviors. In addition, role modeling eating behaviors is key to helping children choose nutritious foods to try. So For example, if we serve the child ground beef with rice, roasted potatoes, and carrots, but we're eating hamburgers and French fries, those children are going to want what's off of our plate and not eat those healthy foods in front of them, right? And what we say about food can impact child's eating behaviors. All right, we've set the stage about the importance of how we use words to help children make nutritious food choices. Now let's apply this in several ways. First, we will start by using CCNPs, as Kristen had talked about earlier, and helpful phrases to encourage food consumption. Keep in mind, we are using age-appropriate language. So if children are older, your language may look different. Describing a food can help children start associating with other foods they like. For example, the vegetable is a sweet potato. It tastes sweet. You can compare that food with other sweet foods that the child eats. You can talk about how a food can help them do something that is important to them, such as eating the banana can give you energy to play. Most children want to play and have energy to do this. Another developmental skill a child might like is to jump. Use that in your language, like drinking the strawberry and spinach smoothie can help you jump high. You can go into more detail as they get older, like the smoothie can make your bones strong so that you can jump high, or other activity they might be interested in. Maybe the child needs a buddy to eat with a new food to try. You can be that friend and encourage them to try it with you together so they're not alone in that process. If a child tries a new food, whether they like it or not, you can praise that they tried it. They may try it again in the future. I have a 2.5-year-old daughter, and this is what I do all the time. If she just puts it in her mouth, I am praising her. I am saying, you did such a great job, and she's encouraged to try it again. We know that every food we introduce may not result in children trying it right away, and that's okay. If a child refuses to eat a food, use neutral phrases. For example, you can say, we can try this vegetable together again another time. This encourages them that there is another chance to try it, and maybe you're giving it in a different way too. Maybe you prepared it differently, and you're letting them know that you'll serve it again later, but today, maybe it's not their day. Also, this can be an opportunity to learn about the child's likes and dislikes on how foods are served. You can ask, next time, would you like to try it mashed, like mashed potatoes, instead of roasted in pieces? You can let them know that they have a choice in choosing what they eat by saying, when you are ready, you can give it a try. So you're giving them some autonomy as well in terms of letting them know that they have the choice to eat what's on their plates. But you always want to encourage the foods that they eat. Now, we can't control words that come out of a child's mouth, so it can sound negative. It's our job to reframe that conversation to make it more neutral or a positive experience. It's important to validate their opinion, but change the way we talk about food. For example, a child is served steamed broccoli. The child might taste it and say, this broccoli tastes weird. Here are a few phrases you can say to reframe that conversation. Validate them by saying, that does taste different, doesn't it? Ask their opinion. How would we make this taste better? Perhaps a child has a favorite sauce or dressing they would like to pair it with, or maybe they would like the broccoli cooked differently. Maybe they like roasted broccoli or sauteed broccoli instead. Question them on what they will eat on their plates. What will you eat today on your plate that makes your body strong? So you're taking the attention away from the broccoli if they have if they're saying negative words, and just refocusing what on their plate they will eat instead. We want to empower children and give them a sense of autonomy when choosing the foods they eat. You can start by asking what food on your plate is your favorite to eat. You can then go around the table and ask everybody what their favorite food was on their plate. Then you can comment, wow, did you notice that everybody likes something different on their plate? This shows that everyone has a different like when it comes to food choices. Another question that you could ask is, what vegetable would you like to eat tomorrow? Now, that would be an open-ended question that's too broad, right? So you can give them a choice, such as, would you like broccoli or green beans? But it still gives them the opportunity to choose the foods they will try. This is not a new concept for most of you, but worth reiterating and emphasizing the importance of choice. Let's bring culture into the conversation. The way we eat, serve, and choose foods to eat can be impacted by our culture. Children are making memories that will be referred to as they get older on how they feel about the foods they eat. I grew up in a Puerto Rican household, so a typical meal revolved around having a protein, a grain, and a vegetable on the plate. For example, I had pernil, which is a slow-cooked pork, usually paired with rice and red kidney beans. It was in a red sauce. And every time I think about that, it brings a warm feeling to me, makes me salivate a little bit and get excited because of the tenderness of the meat, but as well as that perfect combination of the rice and the beans together. Serving cultural foods keeps children's heritages alive. If you are in a childcare center, or you can add to your menu cultural dishes based off of those in your care once per week or when possible. Also, if you have the opportunity to include children in the kitchen, start them young, whether they are just observing or maybe they're helping out in some small way, like giving you a can of beans or counting the vegetables or how many garlic cloves have to go into this recipe. They can really start learning how food is actually prepared. And if they're like me, to this day, I still call my parents for Puerto Rican recipes that I can share with my own daughter and family. Getting children to understand that there are different cultures and ways to eat food doesn't have to be a formal learning moment. Converse at the table about what they are eating. You can ask if a food on their plate could be paired with another food, such as what other foods do you eat with rice? We've opened up the chat box for you to participate in this conversation. So go ahead, what foods would you eat with rice? So I talked about red kidney beans. We also do gandules, which you'll see a picture of that later. But that's pigeon peas with yellow rice. I see here, oh, thank you, Boston baked beans, chicken and veggies, gumbo. Oh, such a great one, tofu, eggs. Wow, a lot of them are coming in. Stir fry, adding it in. So wonderful. Y'all have a great, oh, I see curry as well and shrimp. So there's a lot of different things that you can pair with rice. I really do like talking about rice because it can carry on a lot of flavor as well. But let's go ahead and continue forward. Okay. Another example is pointing out to children to explore their foods, such as look at what is inside the samosa. What do you see? By asking this, you are helping them identify foods they are eating. They can go a step further and talk about the foods that are encased in dough. You can ask, what other foods could we put inside? Go ahead in the chat, write what you would encase in dough. Maybe this is part of your culture. In my family, we make baked pastelitos where we stuff ground beef or pork with cheese. And that's something we really enjoy as a family. I see other individuals saying carrots. You can actually crawfish pie. I see in here ground beef, potato, and mushroom. Ooh, that's a good combination. Peas and carrots, cheese and spinach. Okay, I see pierogies. Yes, pierogies. That's encased in dough. Yes, absolutely. I see more eggs and potatoes, so maybe more of a breakfast kind of thing. So great ideas. And so this is the conversation that you're having around the table already. Okay, so as you may have noticed, I like to describe food. This is an important skill for children to learn at an early age. Teaching them word descriptors will help expand children's vocabulary when describing foods. This will also help children communicate better on how they feel about food to teachers, parents, guardians, and their peers. As part of educating on vocabulary, we would encourage children not to say words like yuck, gross, or icky. Some children might really love the food they are trying, but when someone says these negative words, like the ones mentioned, they may be discouraged to keep trying it. Sometimes children just can't find the words they're looking for. So on the next slide, we will give you a list of words that you can use and teach just to get you started. All right, so keep in mind, this is just a list of words that you could use, but there are many more words that you could add. The first sentence we will tackle is our vision. What do we see on our plate? Here are some descriptive words to try. Cheesy, colorful, greasy, runny, soggy, yummy. Another one, children could also be listening to their foods. Is it crispy, crunchy, sizzling, or making a squishy sound? How about what the food smelled like? Is it citrusy, fishy, fresh, minty, or spicy? Let's talk about texture. What does the food feel like in your hands when you touch it? How about when it is in your mouth? Is it chewy, creamy, crunchy, dry, juicy, mushy, smooth, or sticky? Now that the food has reached your mouth, what does it taste like? Is it bland, fruity, salty, sour, spicy, strong, sweet, or tart? Other descriptors could involve the temperature of the foods. Is it cold, freezing, hot, or warm? In the next few slides, we will be having you describe the dish you see on this slide by using your imagination and personal experience. All right, so let's go ahead and ask you the first question. What does the pork chop look like to you? Is it cheesy, colorful, dry, greasy, juicy, runny, shiny, soggy, yummy, or other? If it's an other, write it in the chat. I'm more than welcome to give other descriptors. So go ahead, you can choose as many as you want. Because remember, descriptors, there could be more than one that you're experiencing at one time. Okay, I see a few people, sweet, succulent. Okay, so that's what it's looking like to you. Wonderful. And I see many of you said juicy, colorful, and shiny, and yummy. I saw quite a few put that in there, so thank you. Okay, let's go to the next question. What might you hear from the plate? So when you're looking at that pork option, what might you be seeing on the plate? Is it crispy, crunchy, sizzling, maybe came right out of the kitchen? Is it squishy or other? So what would you put on there? I see someone wrote crunchy in the chat, but you can select that in the poll. If there's other, you can go ahead and put that in there. Now you can apply this. This exercise can be applied to any food. This is just an example that we're giving with you today, but you can do this to any food or any dishes. Okay, so I see quite a few you said sizzling and squishy. A few of you said crunchy and crispy. And thank you. And I did see chewy as well as another one to hear. So we're talking about hearing. Okay, so let's go to the next question. What is the pork's texture when you eat it? So is it chewy, creamy, crunchy, dry, juicy, mushy, smooth, sticky, or other? And I really love doing this exercise in the table, talking to individuals, because this can really help figure out how to prepare foods differently or keep it the same. So depending on what children like around you, what they enjoy, this is a really great way to bring that conversation, but you're also taking into account their point of view, which I think is important. Okay, so I see a few people putting chewy and juicy in the chat. I see most of you said juicy and chewy were the two biggest descriptors here. So thank you so much for sharing that with me. All right, and the last question we're going to ask you is, what does the pork taste like to you? Is it bland, fruity, salty, sour, spicy, strong, sweet, tart, cold, warm, or other? And again, other, put it in the chat, but you can select more than one of what pork tastes like to you. And again, you can do this with any fruit, vegetable, grain as well, any other meats or meats alternate as well. But your experience might be different. Maybe you've had this pork in different styles. Maybe it was in a curry one day, but we're talking about the one in this plate here today. So what would it be for you? Maybe it is sweet. Maybe there is some spice in it. We just don't know. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what y'all said. So I see a lot of people did put sweet and salty, and then spicy, fruity as well. And you know, that's all about flavoring the foods, right? And that's our own experiences. And I did see other people saying it does come out warm, which that's a good thing, right? Okay, so thank you so much. Okay, so we've discussed many ways to encourage healthy food consumption in children. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Each child is different. Decide which ones work best for your family or childcare dynamic. Remember to adapt strategies and make them age appropriate. And work with children on becoming better communicators by choosing food descriptors. The more children can communicate about the foods they eat, the easier it will be to address picky eating. Another strategy to encourage food consumption is trying to make foods more approachable by incorporating some age-appropriate learning moments at the table. When working with toddlers, they are learning colors, shapes, food identification. Use this knowledge and apply it to the foods they eat. Maybe they're counting the number of peas on their plate, or perhaps they describe the shape of a cracker. You can help children learn what foods they are eating by letting them know they're eating, maybe it's a a chopped pork or an egg or broccoli, whatever that may be. As children move on to preschool, you can add flavor descriptors. And in elementary school age children, it can get more detailed in talking about the differences and similarities of foods and how foods can help the body stay healthy. Okay, in addition, you can serve foods in a fun way, such as using cookie cutters to cut sandwiches or vegetables into fun shapes. Just keep in mind food waste. Perhaps the leftovers that you're cutting from making those fun shapes, maybe they're part of your lunch. All right. We've talked about language around food, but where can this be most effective? When we eat together, or also known as family style dining. Gathered around the table, whether at home or in a daycare setting, this concept is the same. Parent, caregiver, or daycare provider sit at the same table with the children. This removes the concept of having a kids' table versus adults' table. Everyone should be part of the conversation. Eating together is a social activity. With a raise of hands, how many of you would consider yourself to be the talker when dining with others? Go ahead and show me. Raise your hands and let me know how many of you would consider yourselves the talkers in the conversation. Okay, I do see a few of you raising your hands. Go ahead, raise your hand. I am for sure the same. I am a talker. How about those who are better at listening? Who's a better listener? Go ahead and let me know as well. Me too. Okay, I see quite a few of you too, sometimes. And some of you do both, I'm seeing here. Some of you say you're better listeners. Thank you. Both of these skills are being learned and helping children become better communicators while also having better self-esteem. We know that eating nutritious foods will provide healthy bodies, but the way we talk and act around food can influence what we eat and how much, as we covered already in this presentation. How we dine can vary by culture. For example, do those in your care or in your own home use silverware like forks and knives, or chopsticks, or possibly no utensils at all? How about the foods? How about the foods that are being served? Talking to families or childcare providers, it's important to keep in mind that how and what we eat should be part of the conversation. You want to encourage families and those in childcare facilities to eat together because it can reinforce cultural traditions. Eating together is also a learning activity. Children have the opportunity to practice motor skills like serving food with a spoon or pouring milk into a cup. They can also learn why foods are good for them, identify foods, colors, and shapes on the table. These are only a few reasons why family style dining is so important. Whether you work in a daycare or are consulting families about healthy eating habits, having rituals and routines at family style mealtime can reduce stress and promote well-being, perhaps because everyone knows their role and what is expected of them, especially if you create age-appropriate jobs for each person. I have a 2.5-year-old, and as I mentioned, and I have her wiping tables. She helps me set up placemats at the table. So I'm giving her age-appropriate tasks to make her feel involved, and it's exciting for her. So doing those age-appropriate jobs for everybody makes everyone work together to put the food on the table. All right, next slide. All right, family style dining is a golden standard, but may not fit exactly as described. Aim for good enough, meaning do the best you can in attempting a family style meal. Perhaps you are a family that has conflicting work schedules or children who have extracurricular activities. Start by just focusing on a snack or an easy meal that most of the family can be together. How about if you take your family on a vacation or a school takes a field trip? The dining style may look different. Perhaps you are eating on picnic benches or eating on a patch of grass, but just make sure everyone's eating together. You can make meal times as short or as long as you need them to be. However, a recent study showed that children who eat for 10 minutes or more in family style meal setting eat more fruits and vegetables. So keeping meal times as short as 10 minutes can show nutritious benefits. Here's a free resource from USDA MyPlate to encourage you to continue using phrases that help and hinder. The link will be added to the chat. We will also be sharing an additional resource with you on the materials covered today that Emily will talk more about, and so you will be able to access this reference as well. So now I'll turn it over to Emily.
Thank you, Isabel. So I am so excited to talk about the role of the healthcare professional with all of this, since we saw a lot of you were healthcare professionals. Next slide. My disclosures are that I work for the National Pork Board. Next slide. The healthcare professional can be a fantastic resource for supporting parents and caregivers when it comes to exposure of a variety of foods, really encouraging them to find foods that reflect their family's culture as well as their budget. When developing resources for clients, it's important to take into consideration the role modeling of positive food behaviors, looking at foods across different budgets, making sure that you're including those culturally significant foods, as well as providing examples with what variety, moderation, and balance of foods look like with those complementary foods, as well as that repeated exposure that Kristen talked about earlier. And then, of course, that language of that positive food talk with children. Next slide. I really want to call this out. Kristen mentioned this earlier in looking at food affordability and access when it comes to dietary patterns. The sooner that the healthcare professional realizes what this looks like for their patient, the better recommendations that they can provide. And this could be budget. It could be if they live in a food desert. It could also be what is the capacity to prepare foods? What does the space look like that they can prepare? And what is the time that they have to prepare? Next slide. So both Isabel and Kristen talked about this too, and I think it's really important to emphasize here that we want to make sure that we're being mindful of those cultural preferences when it comes to the clients and patients. Unfortunately, we see healthcare professionals not including these cultural foods due to unfamiliarity or just the fact that they feel like they're unhealthy or think they're unhealthy. And so it's important to broaden our perspective as healthcare professionals beyond these American-centric foods. Next slide. All right, so with the healthcare professionals, especially the nutrition professionals, it's really critical that you're a part of this conversation. And it's important that you share the variety and showing that you can have a variety of different types of food and exposure to foods, giving the caregiver those resources can really help make all the difference. And why is that important? Well, we know that a variety of nutrients come across a variety of food groups. And we know that a variety of nutrients are needed for the growth and development of children. And so by having more exposure to a variety of foods, you're more likely, or the children are more likely to build a positive relationship with food and enjoy that eating experience. Kristen mentioned it, I mentioned it already, and we'll talk about it again, but really emphasizing those multiple exposures. It can take up to those 30 times for a child to fully accept foods. So recognizing that as a healthcare professional and giving the caregivers the grace and letting them know that it can take multiple times. Next slide. But how do you do that? Well, first, we want to identify what the current familiarity of foods are for children. What are the foods that they like and are already accepting? Then, how do we add in new textures and tastes? And this could be different cooking methods, such as boiled, grilled, slow cooked, different seasonings. It could also be different forms, whether you have mashed, chopped, or shredded. And how are you pairing those with other foods? For example, are you adding beans to a meat chili? Or are you having maybe mashed avocado with shredded pork? There are so many different combinations, and the more that the caregiver can explore that with the child and that repeated exposure, the more likely the child will find a version of that they like, where they might like it with something over here, but not with something over there. I also want to call out the balance of fresh and prepared foods. We talked about food access, and the example I like to give is fruits and vegetables. Oftentimes we think of fresh fruits and vegetables, but that's not always the most accessible. So what about fruit that's canned in 100% juice or canned veggies that's low sodium? It's easy to have on hand, it's affordable, and it has little to no preparation to get it on the plate. Remember, the best form of nutrition for a child is what they'll actually eat. So working with that caregiver to find what works best for that family and their lifestyle. Next slide. Now let's walk through a few examples of what varied food exposure can look like with all the things that we've learned so far in this presentation. Next slide. Let's walk quickly through a retail grocery example. This is my background. I come from a retail grocery background, so I really love this example. So pretend like you're putting on a kids cooking class. The area that you're working in has a predominantly Hispanic population with young children or families with young children. So you invite them to your class. The recipe that you choose is pork carnitas tacos because you have a predominantly Hispanic population shopping your store. You choose an easy level for the class because you know that the families attending have young children. And with that, the level, you have everything that's already prepared, so it's ready to assemble. You let each caregiver and child taste test the ingredients by themselves and then have them describe the foods with flavor and nutrition in mind. So talking, pork carnitas help me learn, black beans give me energy, this avocado is creamy, and so on. And ask the kids if they like the ingredient, reminding them not to yuck someone else's yum. Then you go on to assembling the tacos. And this could look like you're having some of the kids mash the avocado for guacamole or mixing a salsa together, having them put together those tacos, and then being able to have that conversation of how they like this in the varied form. It's different than the ingredients were by themselves. And now they're trying it as the tacos. And then provide more examples of how the families can take that home and work through different varied forms, such as using rice instead of tortillas or cubed avocado instead of mashed. I would love for you to put in the chat here if you what you would say to a child if they didn't necessarily like the pork carnitas tacos or didn't want to try it. This will help you jump. All right. I'm proud of you for trying that. Let's make them into tacos. All right, let's talk about how we can further engage and empower children to try new foods. I know Isabel had mentioned earlier using cookie cutters, but you could also use colored plates, character pokers, bright colored utensils. If you want to put it in the chat too, I would love to hear some ideas that you have that you could use to get kids excited about mealtime. And remember, these don't have to cost money. They could be coloring a piece of paper and making placemats for everyone at the table, painting with foods, toothpicks, games during meal times. There are so many different options that you could do to make mealtime fun. Also remembering the family meals. How are we incorporating those conversations at mealtime? And then again, how are we involving children in mealtime decisions? This is one of my favorites. We really can get them involved from grocery shopping, having them choose between macaroni or spaghetti noodles. You could also have them be part of deciding what you're going to eat, tacos or pasta. Also, getting them involved with washing fruits and veggies, opening a can of beans, and so on. There are so many creative ways that you as the healthcare professional can work with caregivers to get the kids involved at home. Next slide. We know picky eating, having that reminder of those multiple exposures up to that 30 times and really working with those caregivers to give them grace, knowing that it can take a lot of times that you're trying and having those different food exposures. And so telling them not to give up. I also want to quickly mention food safety and making sure that we're preparing meats, especially to the correct temperature, because if they're over or undercooked, you can have a poor eating experience. It could taste off and the texture could be off. So remembering to cook to those safe temperatures. All right, before I hand it back to Jeb, I want to speak on some of the resources that we have. We have some links that we're going to be putting into the chat where we have some handouts that you can share with clients and patients that go over some of these phrases that you can use in walking through how you're introducing and exploring tastes and textures with food. We also have our Surprisingly Pork campaign, where we're really looking to bring excitement to talking about pork. So we'll put the link in the chat there if you want to check that out. And last but not least, I want to invite you to join Pork and Partners. We'll add the link to join our monthly newsletter there if you're interested. We have the latest pork research. We're also talking about recipes, having CEU opportunities like this, and highlighting more than just pork. We're highlighting what resources that we can use to do our jobs better, exactly like this presentation today. And with that, I will hand it back over to you, Jeb.
All right. Thank you, Emily. And thank you to all of our presenters. I think they all did a really fantastic job of presenting some of the science, some of the practice, to really encouraging these healthier, more positive eating habits among younger children. Actually going to start with a couple more Zoom call questions just to see how people have maybe learned or changed. So the first question is, will you rethink how you use language and phrases to nudge children towards healthy eating habits? Wow, that's incredible. Over 99% of you are definitely thinking about how you're going to change the way that you're going to use language. That's really impressive. All right. And then going back to the one from the beginning, do you see pork as a high quality, affordable, and culturally appropriate protein choice to help nudge children toward healthy eating habits? And I'll just say, I saw a lot of comments in the chat that sometimes pork isn't always the best protein option, you know, regarding religious restrictions for a lot of diets. But, you know, I think you can take a lot of what we've learned today and use it for any of the foods that we are, you know, serving in our programs or serving to our kiddos. So great. So it seems like, you know, 89%, almost 90% are definitely thinking of pork as, you know, one of those really high quality carrier foods to help promote other healthy foods on the plate as well. Well, that's really wonderful. So let's just move right on to some housekeeping with your CEU certificate. So as you go to claim your 1 CPE for this presentation from CBR, the credentialing agency of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, you can check the chat for today's suggested performance indicators. This is also an ethics-related CPEU activity pre-approved, so feel free to use it for that ethics competency. Your certificate of attendance will be sent out via email after today's presentation, so please check your inbox and let us know of any questions or concerns related to today's webinar or the CPE certificate of attendance by emailing nutrition@pork.org. If you're watching this webinar as a recording, that's also okay. Participants who watch the recording can also claim their CPEU by visiting porkcheckoff.org under the News tab, or by viewing the on-demand webinar on our Pork and Partners Continuing Education page. I want to start with one question for our panelists, if they're available, particularly around, we've had some really great conversation in the chat through the Q&A about, you know, how some of the research around conversations at meal times has changed. So some folks are saying, you know, you should focus on talking about just the food and maybe not the nutrition aspect of it. Some folks are saying, you know, maybe you need to focus on not talking about the food at all. And so I just wanted to ask, maybe this is a good question for Emily and Isabel, you know, what are your experiences working directly with kiddos on having these conversations? And what's your experience then with talking about food, talking about nutrition directly with your own kids or the kids that you work with?
Sure, I can start off a little bit. So yeah, all the strategies, I think everybody mentioned a little bit of different things, maybe not talking about the food sometimes works. If you don't put attention on it, it's okay. A lot of times though, we do want to prepare kids if there's something new coming. You know, maybe it's not at the mealtime. Maybe you're like, hey, avocados, you know, do you know what they look like? You want to touch it before we make it, or just introducing it to them, giving them a heads up what it looks like and things even before it even reaches the table. It doesn't have to, as I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be formal. It can be very just fun, and talk about the colors it is, because I have a 2.5-year-old. So my personal experience is that I talk to my daughter about colors and shapes. And so for her, that's fun. We count blueberries at the table, but I'm not saying eat these blueberries. I'm saying how many blueberries are there? What color are there? So it's not really focusing on the food, like eat this food. It's more of what's on your plate. Let's have fun together and explore it. But there's a lot of different methods that you can do. Emily, do you have any other things to add?
I was just going to say, and we saw this in the chat, creating that no pressure environment for children to explore those foods is really important. And it can be done in a variety of ways, but not putting the pressure on the child to try something. Remember, it takes those 30 exposures. So letting them try it and trying again in a different way at another time.
And I just want to tie in that socio-ecological model. There's many different opportunities. So whether it's at the table or beyond, don't feel so pressured of many of the things that we've talked about. These are all just tools in your toolboxes to just expose children in different ways.
Great. Well, thank you all for some of that. And just maybe one more question before we end today. We had a question about how to reframe maybe a really negative message coming from the kiddo themselves. I think we had one participant mention that their kid mentioned that pork is the meat of a dead animal. That's gross. I don't want to eat that. I was wondering how some of you might change the conversation to turn that in a more positive light.
So I think when you're talking about food language, it's okay for children to have their own voice, and you just talk about, maybe you expose them at a different time with a different preparation method. But I don't think you should ever discount what they're saying. They're allowed to have their opinions. And that's our jobs as caregivers and healthcare professionals, to just give those exposures and allow them to say what's on their mind. And Isabel, you may have another strategy working with CACFP.
Yes, I actually do recognize. I always say thank you for sharing that with me. I want to recognize that they've said something important. And you can talk about it, saying, yes, we do eat pork. Pork comes from pigs. We can have that conversation too, and talk about how it helps us stay healthy, or if that's part of our culture and part of what we eat, right? So there's conversations that you're going to have to formulate it a little bit to the age, right? Depending on the age of the child, you have to formulate how you're going to say it for them to understand what you're saying.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, all the panelists, for their just wonderful presentation today. And thank you all for attending the webinar today. Again, look for your email for those CPU certificates. And thanks for joining us today. Have a lovely afternoon.